I love you, Mommy.
I love you, Mommy. I'll see you soon. 9-year-old Melina Frattolin said those words into the phone on the evening of July 19th, 2025. Her mother, back home in Montreal, could hear the excitement in her voice. A girl talking about the last stretch of a road trip, already thinking about being back in her own bed, her own room, telling her friends all about it. It was an ordinary goodbye. The kind parents hear 1,000 times and never think twice about. It was also the last time she would ever hear her daughter's voice. Hours later, a 911 call went out. A man's voice, frantic, urgent, telling a dispatcher that his 9-year-old daughter had just vanished off the side of a highway, pulled into a white van by two strangers, somewhere in a remote stretch of the Adirondacks. Within hours, an Amber Alert stretched across the state of New York. State troopers, K-9 units, helicopters, forest rangers, dozens of people moving through dense woods in the middle of the night, searching for a little girl who might still be out there, alive, terrified, in the hands of two men no one could yet identify. But almost as fast as that search began, something about it started to feel off. The story kept shifting. The van's description changed. The timeline didn't sit right. And the harder investigators looked, the less any of it seemed to add up. Welcome to the homicide room, where monsters are fished out for punishment. If this is your first time here, go ahead and subscribe and turn on notifications, because this is a case that's still unfolding in real time. There hasn't been a trial yet, there hasn't been a verdict, and we're going to walk through this one carefully, the way it actually happened, not the way it gets exaggerated online. And down in the comments, let us know where in the world you're watching from. It's honestly one of my favorite parts of putting these videos together, seeing just how far this community stretches. All right, let's get into it. Before we go any further into the arrest, the charges, or any of what investigators allege happened, I want you to actually know who Molina was. Court documents will call her the victim. News reports will call her the 9-year-old. But she had a name, a laugh, a favorite animal, a mother who spent every day since that call in July waiting for answers. Melina Frattolin was 9 years old. She lived in Montreal, Quebec, Canada, with her mother, who had full legal custody of her. Her parents, Luciano and Melina's mother, had been separated since 2019, which meant Melina split her time in the way a lot of kids of separated parents do, living full-time with her mom and visiting her dad whenever he came up to Canada, or whenever the two of them planned a trip together, like the one that would end up being her last. From the outside. And this is honestly one of the hardest parts of this entire story to sit with. Melina's life looked joyful. Her father posted photos of her constantly on his social media, the kind of steady, public documentation a lot of proud parents keep. There's one of her sledding through fresh snow, bundled up in a winter coat, clearly having the time of her life. There's another from what looks like Valentine's Day, Melina standing next to a horse, grinning at the camera. Another where her dad is hugging her tightly, kissing the top of her head on what appears to be her birthday, candles, maybe just blown out moments before. If you're a parent, or honestly, even if you're not, looking at those photos now, knowing how this story ends, is genuinely difficult. Because in every single one of them, Melina just looks like a normal, happy 9-year-old kid being loved by her dad. There's nothing in any of those images that hints at what would come months, or in some cases, weeks later. That's part of what makes cases like this one so disorienting to sit with. The photographic record of a childhood doesn't always tell you anything about what's happening underneath it. On July 11th, 2025, Melina crossed the border from Canada into the United States with her father for what was supposed to be a 10-day father-daughter vacation. According to police, the two of them spent that time bouncing around New York City, parts of Connecticut, a few stops in upstate New York. If you picture it, it probably looked like most family road trips look from the outside. A rental car packed with bags, stops for food, maybe a museum, maybe a hike, maybe just wandering around a city neither of them knew that well. By every outward appearance, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. Quality time between a father and his daughter, the kind of trip a lot of separated parents plan specifically to make sure their kids don't feel like the distance between two households means less time together. On the evening of July 19th, what should have been one of the final nights of that trip, Melina called her mother. She told her that she and her dad were heading home, back up toward Montreal. According to investigators, on that call, Melina didn't sound distressed, didn't sound afraid. Just a 9-year-old girl telling her mom she'd see her soon, probably talking about what she'd tell her friends about the trip, maybe already thinking ahead to being back in her own room, her own bed, her own routine. What would you have done in that moment, hanging up the phone after a completely normal, unremarkable conversation with your daughter, having absolutely no idea that call would be the last time you ever heard her voice? It's one of those questions that doesn't really have an answer. You can't prepare for something like that. Nobody can, because it was the last call. Just hours later, everything about that ordinary vacation would change completely, and a mother in Montreal would begin a wait that no parent should ever have to go through. So let's walk through exactly what happened that night based on what's been made public through police statements and court filings. At around 10 p.m. on July 19th, 2025, Melina's father, 45-year-old Luciano Frattolin of Montreal, called 911 from the side of Interstate 87 near the town of Lake George, New York. If you've never been to that part of the country, Lake George sits in the southeastern edge of the Adirondack Park, a resort town surrounded by dense forest, winding mountain roads, and long stretches of highway where cell service can be spotty and towns are few and far between. It's the kind of place where, if something happens off the main road, it can feel very isolated very quickly. According to police, Frattolin told the dispatcher he'd pulled the car over near exit 22 to use the bathroom. He said he stepped away into a wooded area just off the shoulder of the highway, and when he came back to the vehicle, Melina was simply gone. In that initial account, he described seeing a suspicious white van fleeing the scene, heading south on the interstate. Then, according to police, in a follow-up interview, his story shifted. He told investigators that 2 unknown men had actually forced Melina into that van, a detail that hadn't been part of his first telling of events. At first, nothing about this seemed unusual, at least not to the officers taking the initial report. A frantic father, a missing child, a description, however vague, of a vehicle potentially involved. This is exactly the kind of call that law enforcement is trained to treat with total urgency, regardless of how the story eventually turns out. Because in the rare cases where a child genuinely has been abducted by strangers, every single minute matters enormously. New York State Police responded accordingly. They issued an Amber Alert that night, and multiple agencies mobilized almost immediately. State troopers, K-9 units, aviation support, meaning helicopters equipped for aerial searches, forest rangers, who know that terrain better than almost anyone, county sheriff's departments from both Warren and Essex counties. All of it converging on a rural, densely wooded part of the Adirondack region, searching through the night for a 9-year-old girl who, as far as the searchers knew at that point, might still be out there, alive, terrified, in the hands of 2 unknown men. Imagine being one of those searchers. Imagine walking through dark woods at 2 or 3 in the morning, flashlight beam cutting through the trees, knowing that somewhere out there might be a child in real, immediate danger. That's the emotional weight this search carried for every single person involved in it for those first many hours. But then something didn't add up. Here's where the story really starts to unravel. As investigators began working the case in those early hours, running down leads, canvassing the area, pulling whatever traffic footage might exist along that stretch of highway, they went back over Frattolin's account of what happened. And the details just didn't line up. His story shifted between tellings. The white van description changed, the sequence of events changed. And when they searched for any actual evidence to support the abduction, traffic cameras along I-87, witnesses who might have seen a van matching the description, anything, they came up completely empty. No corroboration. Nothing. Does that sound suspicious to you? Because it did to the investigators working this case, and it happened fast. Within about a day, they'd already begun shifting their focus, quietly, methodically, the way investigations tend to move when something doesn't fit the story they've been given. At the same time, detectives were also working backward through the actual timeline of that evening, trying to account for every hour. They already knew Molina had called her mother around 6:30 p.m., sounding completely fine. No distress, nothing alarming in her voice, nothing to suggest anything was wrong. But Frattolin didn't call 911 until roughly 10 p.m. That gap, those missing 3.5 hours between a perfectly normal phone call and a frantic 911 report, became one of the most important windows in the entire investigation. What happened in those hours? Where were they? What was said or done or decided? Those questions sit at the very heart of this case, and as of now, they still haven't been fully, publicly answered. On Sunday, July 20th, the day after the Amber Alert went out, less than 24 hours after that initial 911 call, investigators organized a coordinated search in a specific area near the town of Ticonderoga, New York, roughly 30 miles north of Lake George, a location Frattolin was believed to have visited sometime the night before. This wasn't a random sweep of the woods. It was a targeted search based on information investigators had already pieced together, which tells you something about how quickly this case was moving even in that first day. Multiple agencies were part of that search detail: state police, forest rangers, county sheriff's offices, the Department of Environmental Conservation, all working in coordination, moving through dense, remote terrain near the Vermont border. And at around 1:50 in the afternoon, members of the New York State Police Forest Rangers found Molina. She was in the shallow water of a pond. According to the criminal complaint later filed in court, her body had been concealed under a log. In that instant, standing at the edge of that pond, this stopped being a search for a missing child. It became a homicide investigation, and the man who, less than 24 hours earlier, had called 911 sobbing about an abduction was now the primary focus of it. What would you have done if you were one of those officers standing at that pond, realizing the emotional, urgent story that had triggered a statewide search the night before might not have been true at all? That's not a hypothetical a lot of people ever have to sit with. But it's exactly what the investigators on this case were dealing with in real time on that Sunday afternoon. I want to be really careful and fair here, because this case is still working its way through the courts, and it's important we treat it that way. Luciano Frattolin has pleaded not guilty to the charges against him. Under the law, in the United States, in Canada, pretty much everywhere that operates under a presumption of innocence, that means he's entitled to be treated as innocent, unless and until a jury decides otherwise, based on evidence presented at trial. So everything in this section is what investigators allege, not a settled, proven fact. That distinction matters, and we're going to hold on to it throughout the rest of this video. According to New York State Police, the working theory is about as devastating as it gets. Investigators believe that sometime after Molina's 6:30 p.m. phone call with her mother and before Frattolin's 911 call at around 10 p.m., Molina died, and that Frattolin then concealed her body and fabricated the entire abduction story to explain her disappearance. At a news conference following the arrest, a state police captain overseeing the investigation stated plainly that authorities believe Molina was already dead by the time the report of a missing child came in. According to that same statement, no evidence was ever found to support Frattolin's account of a white van or of two men forcing Molina into it. Investigators used the word fabricated to describe the abduction report, a strong word, and one that reflects just how quickly and thoroughly that story collapsed under investigation. Do you think this was something calculated in advance, or something that happened suddenly and spiraled out of control from there? That question matters a lot in this case, actually, because it's one investigators themselves are still trying to answer, and it will likely be one of the central questions at trial. There's still a lot we genuinely don't know, and I think it's important to be honest about that rather than fill in gaps with speculation. As of the most recent public reporting available, an official motive has not been confirmed by authorities. At the time the investigation was underway, Molina's official cause of death had not yet been finalized publicly, with an autopsy pending. And Frattolin's defense team has already started challenging parts of the evidence against him, including whether certain statements he made to investigators, reportedly during a 2.5-hour car ride, should be allowed at trial at all, since his attorneys argue he hadn't yet been read his Miranda rights when some of those statements were made. That's a legal fight that's still playing out in pretrial hearings as of the most recent updates on this case. A retired FBI agent who reviewed the publicly available details of this case for a news outlet offered an interesting perspective here, one worth sitting with for a moment. He noted that, in his experience investigating cases like this, when investigators hear an especially dramatic story right out of the gate, a child pulled into an unmarked van by strangers, vanishing without a trace along a highway, that level of drama can itself sometimes be a red flag. Real abductions, he pointed out, don't often look like something out of a movie. They tend to be messier, harder to describe cleanly, less cinematic than the story Frattolin initially gave. And once investigators started asking pointed follow-up questions about the color of the van, the exact sequence of events, the timeline of what happened when, inconsistencies reportedly began surfacing almost immediately. Based on how quickly this case moved from an Amber Alert to an arrest, just 2 days, which is remarkably fast for a case of this magnitude, that same expert suggested the very first interview investigators conducted with Frattolin was likely what cracked the case open. Small inconsistencies followed carefully and persistently, one detail at a time, until the story simply couldn't hold together anymore. That's often how these cases break, incidentally. Not through some dramatic confession, but through the slow, patient work of an investigator asking the same question 3 or 4 different ways until the cracks start to show. Let me know what you think in the comments, because even people with decades of investigative experience have said this case doesn't show clear, obvious signs of long-term planning. It looks, by that assessment, more like a reaction to something in the moment rather than a scheme built over weeks or months. But what exactly that something was, what happened in those missing hours, what was said, what triggered whatever happened next, remains one of the central, unanswered mysteries of this entire case, and probably will until we hear more at trial. So who is Luciano Frattolin, really? Because on paper, and certainly online, he looked like exactly the kind of father anyone would want their child to have. Publicly, he's described as the founder of an organic coffee company. On that company's own website, in a biography written about him, it states that Molina was, in his words, the light of his life, and the inspiration, he wrote, for everything he did. That's the kind of language a lot of us have seen before, in bios, in social media captions, in the way people talk about their kids when things are good. It's not unusual. It's the kind of thing that, in almost any other context, would just be a nice detail about a devoted parent. According to that same biography, Frattolin grew up in Ethiopia, and part of what motivated his work, building what he described as a more equitable and just world through his business, was rooted in a desire to spare his daughter from the same kinds of social injustices he experienced as a child growing up there. It's a compelling personal narrative, the kind that probably helped build trust with customers, with his community, with anyone who came across his story online. His social media presence backed all of that up, consistently, over what appears to have been years. Photo after photo of father-daughter moments, sledding trips in winter, birthday hugs, vacations to new places. The kind of digital footprint that, in hindsight, makes this entire case so much harder to process. Because it doesn't look like the digital footprint of someone hiding something. It looks like the digital footprint of someone who, at least outwardly, built a significant part of his public identity around being a loving, present father. According to police, Frattolin had no prior criminal history, no documented history of domestic violence. Nothing in his background, nothing that had ever been reported, nothing that had ever resulted in a police visit or a restraining order or any kind of formal record that would have flagged him, on paper, as a risk to his own child. That absence of any warning signs is actually one of the more unsettling aspects of this case for a lot of people following it, because it undermines the comforting idea that violence like this always announces itself in advance. Sometimes, according to the pattern investigators describe here, it doesn't. He and Melina's mother had been separated since 2019. She retained full custody, meaning Melina lived with her mother full-time in Montreal, and Frattolin's relationship with his daughter was maintained largely through visits. Visits like the 10-day trip through the United States that, according to police, was always meant to end with him bringing her safely home to her mother in Montreal that same weekend. It's worth noting that plenty of separated or divorced parents maintain exactly this kind of relationship with their kids for years without incident. Regular visits, road trips, holidays split between two households. On paper, there was nothing unusual about the structure of this trip at all. That detail sits right at the emotional core of this entire case. Whatever happened during those missing hours on the night of July 19th, it happened at the very tail end of what was supposed to be a father-daughter vacation. On what should have been one of the last nights before Melina went home to her mom, back to her own room, her own school starting up again before too long, her own life continuing on the way a 9-year-old's life is supposed to continue. If there's a twist buried in this story, it's not a hidden third party, and it's not some elaborate conspiracy waiting to be uncovered in a future episode of true crime coverage. The twist here is just how quickly and completely the original story fell apart under basic scrutiny, and what that speed might tell us about the nature of what actually happened. Think about it for a second. Within a single day, a case that started as a statewide Amber Alert, with an active manhunt, aircraft in the sky, K-9 units combing the woods through the night, an entire region on edge, had completely flipped. The father who'd made the emotional 911 call, the father whose photos of sledding trips and birthday hugs were still sitting there on social media for anyone to see, was now the person investigators were building a homicide case against. And here's something worth sitting with, because it separates this case from a lot of others we cover on this channel. Frattolin, according to police, didn't run. He didn't try to cross back into Canada before anyone noticed anything was wrong. He didn't disappear, didn't go dark, didn't do any of the things that might suggest someone actively trying to evade capture. Instead, he called 911 himself, and in doing so, set an enormous, resource-heavy search effort into motion. A search that, according to investigators, was very likely already too late to matter, because they believed Molina had died hours before that call was ever made. Does that detail seem suspicious to you, or does it complicate the picture? Because honestly, I think it does both. On one hand, it doesn't fit the profile of someone trying to flee accountability in the way we sometimes see in cases like this. Someone who runs, who crosses a border, who disappears for days or weeks before finally being caught. On the other hand, according to the theory investigators have laid out, it fits a very different, much colder pattern. Someone attempting to redirect the story entirely, to control the narrative from the very start, rather than escape it. It's the difference between running from a fire and trying to convince everyone the fire never happened in the first place. There's also the matter of those missing 3.5 hours. The stretch of time between Melina's phone call with her mother at 6:30 p.m., sounding completely fine, and Frattolin's 911 call at 10 p.m. Whatever happened in that window is, according to everything publicly available right now, still the central unanswered question of this entire case. Investigators have said they'll be closely examining phone records, location data, and any other communications from that period as the case moves toward trial. That evidence, if it exists and if it holds up, could end up being the thing that either confirms or complicates the entire theory investigators have built. It's also worth remembering that the mother's phone call with Molina at 6:30 p.m. is, right now, essentially the last confirmed, verified point of contact anyone has with Molina while she was still alive. Everything after that point, everything about those missing hours, exists only through what Frattolin has told investigators and through whatever physical and digital evidence detectives are able to piece together independently. That's an incredibly narrow window for a family and for investigators to have to work with. If this case has unsettled you the way it's unsettled us, go ahead and hit that like button. It genuinely helps get accurate, careful reporting on cases like this one in front of more people, especially while the facts are still developing and there's so much noise out there that isn't always accurate. Luciano Frattolin was arrested and formally charged on July 21st, 2025, just 2 days after Molina disappeared. The charges against him are second-degree murder and concealment of a human corpse. He pleaded not guilty at his arraignment in Ticonderoga Town Court, standing before a judge in the same small Adirondack town where his daughter's body had been found not even 48 hours earlier. Because both Frattolin and Molina are Canadian citizens, there was some early public discussion about how jurisdiction would work in a case like this. A question a lot of people watching this story unfold from outside the U.S. legal system probably had too. New York State Police addressed that directly at their press conference. Because the alleged crime occurred within the United States, Frattolin would be prosecuted in the U.S., regardless of either of their citizenship. Canadian authorities were notified, as is standard in cases involving a foreign national facing charges abroad, giving them the right to check in on how he's being treated and to offer consular support. But the actual prosecution, the trial, the entire legal process, all of it falls under New York's jurisdiction, handled by Essex County's court system. Since the arrest, this case has continued moving steadily through the legal system, the way these cases typically do, slowly, methodically, with a lot happening behind the scenes that doesn't always make headlines. An Essex County grand jury handed up a formal indictment against Frattolin, meaning a group of citizens reviewed the evidence prosecutors presented and determined there was enough to move forward with formal charges. Frattolin has remained in custody at the Essex County Correctional Facility since his arrest after a judge determined he presented a flight risk, a reasonable concern given that he's a foreign national with the means and connections to potentially leave the country if released. As of the most recent reporting available, his trial has been scheduled to begin in the summer of 2026, roughly a year after Molina's death. That gap between arrest and trial might seem long to some people watching this unfold, but it's actually fairly typical for a case of this seriousness. Cases involving second-degree murder charges require extensive pretrial preparation, evidence review, expert witness scheduling, legal motions, jury selection processes, all of which take time, and all of which matter enormously to making sure whatever verdict eventually comes down actually holds up. His defense team, meanwhile, has already begun contesting parts of the case in pretrial hearings. During one recent hearing, a deputy public defender argued that some statements Frattolin made to investigators, reportedly during a roughly 2.5-hour car ride, which appears to have taken place before he was formally read his Miranda rights, should be suppressed, meaning excluded from what prosecutors are allowed to present at trial. This is a completely standard part of the American legal process. The Fifth Amendment protects against self-incrimination, and if a defendant makes statements to police before being properly informed of their right to remain silent and to an attorney, those statements can sometimes be thrown out, depending on the specific circumstances. A judge has been weighing that evidence and those arguments as the case heads toward trial. I want to be completely upfront with you here because it's important and because it's easy in true crime content to lose sight of this. Unlike a lot of the cases we cover on this channel, this one does not have a resolved outcome yet. There's been no trial, no verdict, no sentencing. Everything alleged against Luciano Frattolin remains, legally speaking, an allegation, and under the law, he is entitled to the presumption of innocence unless and until a jury finds otherwise, based on evidence presented in a courtroom, not based on public opinion or how a story looks from the outside. Whatever the eventual outcome of this trial turns out to be, the loss at the center of this case is already permanent, and it's already devastating, regardless of what a jury eventually decides about who is legally responsible for it. Melina Frattolin was 9 years old. She had a mother in Montreal who built her entire life around raising her, who now has to somehow move forward carrying something almost impossible to fully process, that her daughter went on a vacation with her father and simply never came home. That's a kind of grief most people can't fully imagine, and I don't think it's my place, or any of ours, to pretend we can fully understand what that's like. This case has drawn a lot of public attention, both in the United States and in Canada, and I think a big part of why is the sheer contradiction sitting at its center. A father who publicly, repeatedly, called his daughter the light of his life, who posted photo after photo of the two of them together, smiling, close, seemingly devoted, seemingly present in exactly the way a good parent should be. And then, according to prosecutors, on the very last weekend of a 10-day trip meant to celebrate that relationship, something happened that ended her life. That contradiction is uncomfortable in a very specific way because it forces a question a lot of us would rather not think about too closely. How much can any of us really know about a person, even someone who looks, from every visible angle, exactly like who they claim to be? We build our sense of trust in people based on what we can see, their public behavior, the way they talk about the people they love, the photos they choose to share. But those things, as uncomfortable as it is to acknowledge, are only ever a partial window into who someone actually is. Cases like this one, whatever the eventual verdict turns out to be, tend to leave that discomfort behind regardless. Investigators have said there's still a lot they don't know, including, as of the most recent reporting, an official motive. That absence of a clear why is part of what makes this case linger with people the way it does. We're wired to want explanations, reasons, some kind of narrative logic that makes senseless things feel slightly less senseless. And right now, this case doesn't offer that. What we do know is that a massive, coordinated search effort involving state police, forest rangers, K-9 and aviation units, and multiple county agencies working together through the night was mobilized for a little girl who, according to the working theory investigators have laid out, was very likely already gone by the time that search even began. It's worth pausing here, too, to think about the broader systems this case touches. The Amber Alert system exists because, in the vast majority of cases where it's used, time is genuinely the difference between finding a child safe and not finding them at all. Law enforcement doesn't have the luxury of waiting to see if a report is credible before acting. They have to move immediately, every time, because the cost of not moving fast enough in a real abduction is unthinkable. That's exactly what happened here. Officers, rangers, and volunteers moved fast, moved seriously, and treated this as the emergency it was reported to be. The fact that the underlying report turned out, according to investigators, not to be true doesn't diminish the seriousness or the professionalism of that response. If anything, it's a reminder of just how much good faith effort goes into these systems every single time they're activated. Melina Frattolin was 9 years old. She loved horses. She went sledding in the snow. She called her mother on a summer evening to say she was on her way home. And within hours of that call, according to the charges her father is now facing, her life was taken by the very person who was supposed to be bringing her safely back to it. Her father remains in custody, presumed innocent under the law, awaiting a trial that, as of now, is scheduled for the summer of 2026. The charges against him, second-degree murder and concealing a human corpse, describe, if proven true, one of the most devastating betrayals a parent could possibly commit against their own child. But they remain, for now, charges, not a verdict. Not a conviction. And it's important that we hold on to that distinction, even as we tell this story, even as the details are genuinely difficult to sit with. This case leaves behind a question that honestly might not have a clean answer, even after the trial concludes, even after a jury eventually reaches a verdict one way or another. How do you reconcile the version of someone the entire world was shown, the loving photos, the public declarations, the light of his life, with allegations this serious? And what does that mean for how carefully any of us can really know the people closest to us, even the ones we trust with absolutely everything, even the ones whose love, from the outside, looked completely real? Maybe there isn't a satisfying answer to that question. Maybe some cases just leave you sitting with discomfort, without a clean resolution, without a tidy lesson to take away from them. And maybe that discomfort is worth sitting with anyway, rather than looking away from it, because it's part of how we stay honest about the world we actually live in, rather than the safer, simpler version of it we sometimes want to believe in. If this story affected you the way it affected us, share it. Melina's name deserves to be remembered, and remembered accurately, not lost in a news cycle that moves on too fast, onto the next headline, the next case, the next tragedy competing for attention. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Do you think the evidence gathered so far points where investigators say it does? Or do you think there's still more to this story we haven't heard yet? And if you want to stay updated as this case moves toward trial, go ahead and subscribe, because we'll be following this one carefully as it develops the same way we've tried to cover it here, factually, fairly, and with the respect this case and this little girl deserve. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.